Welcome back to Underground Storage Tank Compliance. This will be our 501 tanks module. We're going to discuss some advanced topics related to underground storage tanks. So we're considering this our master's class. And if we come on some more, we may have a 601, which would be our PhD in tankology. How's that? So the topics we're going to talk about today: deflection. I'll explain a little bit of what deflection is, tank tilt, striker plates, how we can have such deep tank pits sometimes, and then the bathtub effects. So deflection, when we talk about deflection, we're talking about bending of the tank walls. And normally this is caused by poor installation. Usually you're supposed to measure tank deflection the whole time you're installing a tank. So as you put soil or pea gravel backfill around it, you got to make sure it stays compacted. If it doesn't get compacted well or the tanks are not installed properly, these tank walls can bend when they're filled or emptied. Usually this deflection combines with high groundwater, and then some deflection, it acts like your lungs. It inflates, deflates, inflates, deflates. So over time it can really tear or work on the materials in the tank. And then related to this is the flattening of the tank bottoms. So what happens when fuel is added to the tanks, sometimes if there's nothing supporting the outside of the tanks, they'll start bowing out. So you can see this one is it's more oval shaped instead of round like it's supposed to be. And so as fuel is added, they'll bow out and they'll become more oblong. And the bottom can start flattening because it gets bowed out. So as the fuel is added, it builds up pressure on the inside of the walls and it pushes out. But as the fuel goes down, if there's groundwater surrounding it, the groundwater starts pushing in, and then it makes the tanks either go back to their original shape or the oval turns the other direction where it's more oval up and down. So that's what deflection refers to. Tank tilt. One of the things they used to do back in the day was they put tanks in at an angle, and they did it on purpose so that one end of the tank would be where water would accumulate. So when the tanks are tilted like that, the probes have to be adjusted so that they account for the tilt. Your drop tubes and overfill devices, those also have to be adjusted so they account for the tilt, because the surface is going to be different for those tanks than it would be. I mean, the distance from the surface to the bottom of the tank is going to be different as you go up or down the tank. So you actually need an expert to identify these differences in height. And usually they'll come in and they'll measure at one end of the tank, and then they'll measure at the other end of the tank to the surface. So if one end of the tank is significantly deeper than the other end, you know that tank has been tilted when it was installed. And this can be done by accident too. And here's just a picture of what a tank tilt looks like. And you can see that the water accumulates more towards one end because of the tilt. And they used to do this because water in just regular fuel always settles to the bottom. But nowadays with water and ethanol, the water mixes in the ethanol and it can be a lot more difficult to determine if water's in there. Striker plates are another thing that you'll find with tanks that are a relatively, well, not new, but they weren't required before a certain time. And the reason they started putting striker plates in these tanks is because measuring tanks, you would use a stick and you would lower the stick to the bottom. Then you would pull the stick up and you'd look at the stick to see how deep the fuel is. Well, you would get a lot of these store workers that would go out and make a game of it. They would bounce the stick off the bottom and try and see how high they could get it to go to catch it. And inadvertently, they would stab holes in the bottom of these tanks. So it became a known problem over time. And so they started putting in the UL standards that you had to have striker plates beneath the openings so that would prevent them from poking holes in the tanks whenever they're lowering inventory or manual stick gauging is going on. And these are just some examples of what striker plates look like in fiberglass tanks. You can see this square right here. That is where they put the striker plate, the metal plate in underneath the openings. And here you can't see it as well, but in the white containment solutions tank, they've also got a striker plate under the openings, and they have those in steel tanks too. One of the ways, if you go out to enough sites, you'll find sites that the sumps for the sub-turbine pump are incredibly deep. For instance, this picture right here, to reach the top of the lid, just to pull the lid out, you have to get down on your stomach and put your hands down inside the tank pit. Inside the sump area. To get into this, you would actually have to get a ladder to crawl down in there and do any kind of work, and it would be considered a confined entry. So the reason that some tank pits, some tank sumps are so deep is that guidance in the old installation manuals required you to slope the piping back towards the tank. And this was so that if the piping developed any kind of issues, the fuel would drain back to the tank. And in a double wall pipe, you would put sump sensors in the STP area, and then when it drained back, it would set off those sump sensors. More recently, some manufacturers have gone to the work groups that make these regulations, and they have said, let's make it so that we don't have to slope back to the tanks. So now the guidance has been revised so that the slope requirements aren't in place anymore, but a lot of locations will still slope straight pipe back towards the tanks just because that's the way it's always done. And then if you have a tank pit that's a long way away from the dispensers, that slope will add up to a lot of depth. So that's why you would have some of these areas that, especially truck stops or places where the tanks are a long way away from the dispensers, the sump can be incredibly deep. We're going to talk about bathtub effect now. So bathtub effect is what we call the area around the tank pit. Usually it's where the backfill material is. If the soil surrounding that area is either a much denser material like a clay type material, or if the groundwater level is super high, you'll have what's called a bathtub effect created by the more porous backfill material. And that bathtub effect will leave you where water can accumulate just from rainfall or other precipitation. And then that can create an effect on the tanks that you need to keep those tanks either A, strapped down, or B, full of some amount of fuel so that they won't float. That's one of the bad effects of the bathtub effect, is it can cause your tanks to actually pop out of the ground. Here's just a couple of pictures of what the bathtub effect is like. The groundwater can accumulate around the tanks and it can build up over time. I had a place that they had an actual leak in one of their water lines and never knew it. And the sump was always full of just crystal clear water. And no matter how much they pumped it out, it would just drain right back in there. So that's one of the things that you've got to look out for in some of these sites, is just the accumulation of water in there. And that's why keeping your sumps tight is so important, because unless you're in a very dry area, there's almost always water around those sumps, and it'll drain in there anytime you get any kind of holes in your sumps. So when we talk about all these things, and especially the bathtub effect and not tying down or keeping your tanks full, the thing that can happen is, you guys have probably seen this video if you watched any of my other talking videos about UST compliance. This is what happens when the bathtub effect takes over at a site and it causes the tanks to actually come out of the ground. So if you have any questions or comments, or you want to know more about underground storage tank compliance, please let me know, and I hopefully will get another video out soon to you guys, and we'll carry on some more. Thanks.